So I'm going to test the audio to make sure. It was not working this morning, and I had to stop the live stream and figure out what somebody had done to the the mic. They keep switching. I don't know why people feel the need to in here and it's working great. I don't know why people feel the need to come in and switch microphones or turn the microphone off. It's just a mystery to me, like why people go into the settings on here. It's like, this is a common computer. Don't do that. Don't screw the settings. But so it's working. So what we should be able to do is we should be able to get through chapter 3 today, which is corporate social responsibility, and then we're caught up. And so the quizzes for 1, 2, and 3 will be due, and then the first exam, module 1 exam will be due, and you will have next class period. You will not have to come to class. I will send out an email on that. You do not have to come to class next class period. I'm giving you that time to take the exam because this is a blended class, so we're supposed to take the exams in class. The problem with that is that the exam has an essay on it, and you need to be able to look up things, and it will take far longer probably if you do a good job on the essay to write, than we have in 75 minutes. So I will talk a little bit about the exam at the end of the hour so that you'll be prepared for that and know what the expectations are. I do this every single semester. I talk about what the expectations are for an essay, and I always get students who write 5 sentences and think that that's sufficient, and then they want to argue and debate, and part of that is a result of today's topic. Why we think we can argue and debate with me about these things is a part of today's topic. So we talked about all of the valid ethical theories. The valid ethical theories are predicated on rational, logic and rational thought. They can therefore be universally applicable, and they allow for no exceptionalism. Now, there are problems, and we talked about the problems with all of the valid ethical theories. There isn't a perfect one out there. You can find ways to criticize each one, but they meet this 3-bar minimum of being based on rational analysis of ideas. They are therefore universally applicable. They can be applied. You can do the calculus, for example, on utilitarianism in communist China. We might come up with different ideas as to what constitutes the greatest happiness, depending on whether or not you believe in communism or whether or not you believe in capitalism, right? And they don't allow you to make exceptions. Now, there are problems with all of them, as I pointed out. There are some challenges to philosophical ethics, and these are used all the time, and they're used by business to justify actions that they want to take that, in my opinion, are less than ethical. And we can talk about some examples of this, right? And we will talk about it when we talk about corporate social responsibility today. I told you that when we talk about utilitarianism, you can trace utilitarianism back to the thinking of modernity and a guy named Niccolò Bernardo de Machiavelli in the Quattrocento, and his writings in The Prince, where he just talks about the raw exercise of power. And you can tease out of The Prince this idea that the ends justify the means. He never explicitly says that. Again, I think Machiavelli gets a very bad rap because I think if you look at what he thought was his major work and his major contribution to society, it was not The Prince. That was written for a specific purpose, for a specific person, and at a specific time. If you want to know more about Machiavelli, I think you have to look at his History of Florence, which was a huge work, and I think you have to look at the discourses on the first 12 books of Titus Livy, which heavily influenced our founding fathers in the form of government that we have today, right? There's an enormous impact on that. Almost nobody reads Livy today, but we are a product of Livy's ideas on Republican forms of government and Machiavelli's looking at the Republican form of government under the Roman Republic during the height of Roman power, which, by the way, lasted for over 1,000 years, right? So one of the things that's interesting to me from a historical perspective is how things are speeding up. One of the things that Americans think is that we are the greatest nation on earth and we're the most powerful, and that we won't ever decline. Every empire has thought about that. It took Rome 1,000 years to fall. I'm not sure it's going to take the American model to not start having problems in less than 1,000 years, and we have. If you want evidence of that, we have not won a war since World War II. We have won no wars that we have engaged in since World War II. None. We've won none of them. The greatest nation on earth has not won. We lost Vietnam. Korea was a draw. I don't think we did a very good job in Iraq, and we just totally pulled out of Afghanistan. So I think we should think about these things in history and their impact and how they impact business, because a lot of business relies on this idea of peaceful international trade. So the challenges to ethics really start in what is called the postmodern era. And when does postmodernity begin? Well, if modernity begins in the Quattrocento and with Machiavelli, postmodernity begins with the thinking of a German philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche, again, is someone who I think gets a very bad rap, just like Machiavelli gets a bad rap for The Prince. Nietzsche gets a very bad rap. Can anybody tell me, or does anybody know what the most widely attributed quote to Nietzsche is and why he gets this bad rap? No, nobody knows. His most widely quoted phrase is that God is dead and we have killed him. God is dead and we've killed him. Why does this begin or demark post-modernity, in my opinion? Some historians may disagree with me. They would be wrong. Nietzsche is the first postmodern person. You all have not read Nietzsche. I was forced to read Nietzsche in my master's program. It was a challenge. It was torture. Some of it's very dark. And I can tell you what I think Nietzsche says, and people will disagree with me on that. And there are reasonable arguments about that. Why does Nietzsche become such a controversial figure? Well, his philosophy was used by Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler to justify the anti-Semitism that regime imposed on Western Europe and the extermination of thousands of Jews. Nietzsche's sister becomes his archivist after he dies, and Hitler even goes to the home of Nietzsche and pays homage to Nietzsche. Nietzsche was not an anti-Semite. He was enormously critical of almost all religions, but he was not anti-Semitic. And in fact, he broke off a friendship with the composer Wagner over Wagner's anti-Semitic ideas. But what does it mean, this phrase that God is dead? And we find this in Nietzsche's greatest work, which is Thus Spoke Zarathustra. What does it mean if we say God is dead? Well, for a lot of us who are sincere believers, that would be a very upsetting idea. And a lot of what we think about in terms of reality is changed after this statement. God is dead. And what does he mean by God is dead and we have killed him? Well, if you went back in time to the point at which Nietzsche's writing this, and he's very prophetic in many respects, this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And there was a huge amount in terms of business and society optimism over this industrial revolution and what it would do for us. And in fact, a modern historian has argued that the Industrial Revolution is the birth of the modern. He's wrong, but maybe it is the point at which the gifts of modernity become to be fully realized. But Nietzsche looks around at this era and he says, you people are crazy. So at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we get what's called the positivist movement. So this is a philosophy that science is going to solve all of our problems. And just like we can come up with, and at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we're coming up with cures that are treating people, and people are beginning to live longer. And Nietzsche looks at all of this and says, this is not necessarily better. And why is it, and in the light of 2 world wars, maybe Nietzsche is right, that this isn't better. Science is a tool. And like a hammer can be used to build a house, I can also use it to bludgeon you to death, right? But at the beginning of this Industrial Revolution and the positivist movement, there was this idea that science was going to answer all of our questions and we would all be just so much better off. Well, science can't answer a lot of our questions. And that's the reason that Nietzsche says that God is dead. Because what was happening is people were relying less. He said, at one point in time, people needed God. And they turned to religion and the church to answer these questions, the questions of knowledge, the question of conduct, and the question of governance. Now we're turning to science to answer these questions. And he says that's not necessarily, so we've killed God. We no longer need him. We're going to promote science and we're going to be able to come up with these answers without reference to a deity. And so God is dead and we've killed him. We've killed him through this scientific movement. And a lot of people were very optimistic that science would solve everything. There were world expositions that were going on in which the latest technology was featured and promoted. And there was an enormous amount of feeling that we were going to become very prosperous. And there was even these quaint notions that perhaps what we would get out of science is the ability to just have so much leisure time. There was this idea in the positivist era that people would have so much time because we would be able to produce things so efficiently that people just wouldn't really have to work very much. And God, what are we going to do with ourselves if that's true? Now, it turns out that most of the great scientific achievements have, I think, made life for most of us, in many ways worse. I think that this device and that device and the other devices that you've got on these tables, in many respects, have made life, I think 75% of human suffering in the postmodern, post-industrial world can be traced to this device. And I'll give you an example of this. My cousin came to visit his mother, who lives in Guthrie. She lives down the street from me. She is, she's 6 years older than my mother, so she's like 80 years old this year, right? She's 80 years old. She had a massive heart attack, and they did a quadruple bypass and saved her life. But, it was very touch and go there for a while. And she lives, and he took vacation from his employer to come out and visit her, and he didn't actually get any visiting done, as far as I could tell, because he is a computer architect, so he's responsible for all of the programmers under him that create a learning management system. So he's the one who oversees that. That's what I guess the definition of a computer architect is, as I understand it. And the entire time he was here, he'd get these calls and people would say, "Can you just jump on a Zoom for 5 minutes?" He never actually got to visit with his mother because he was constantly on a Zoom. And in the olden days, when I was born in 1973, when people took vacation, their employers couldn't just call them on the phone and expect them to jump on a Zoom call. And it's like, it's just 5 minutes. Well, when you have 15 of those a day with people saying, "Can you just jump on a Zoom to help me with this problem?" Suddenly 5 minutes is, 10 hours of work. And you didn't, so this is an example of, we thought this device was supposed to free us of so many things. The computer was supposed to save us more and more time. And what it's done is it's produced more and more work for a lot of us. And Nietzsche looks at that and says, this is horrific. And again, he lived before World War I and World War II. World War I and World War II were examples of the worst of science. We learned how to exterminate people in very efficient and in horrific ways. Mustard gas is the product of science. These vehicles that can drop bombs, and during the Second Gulf War, we watched this with fascination. They would send a bomb out from a bomber, which was way, way up in the sky, beyond the reach of what the Iraqi army could possibly defend against. And this bomb, it's a smart bomb. It's just going down the streets of Baghdad and right into a building, and there goes the whole building. It's led to massive amounts of civilian casualties. It used to be that when we fought wars, there was a battlefield. And the idea of you didn't engage non-combatants was respected. In this day and age, it's impossible to do that. We don't line up on a field and lobby cannonballs at each other. It's smart bombs going down the street of Baghdad and into buildings where we know that that there's going to be what we call collateral damage. So Nietzsche thought that this idea that positivism, that science would provide all the answers, was just insane. Once you start the wheels of doubt turning, it's very hard to stop them. So even though you haven't read Nietzsche, you are in the patrimony of Nietzsche. When we talk about these eras in history, one of the things that I think we have to recognize is that for many people, old ideas and old concepts from past eras may still play a role. And so it took a long time. And I'll give you an example of this in my own experience of how you all are in the patrimony of Nietzsche. When I first started teaching here at UCO, I had graduated with my master's degree from UCO, and I was teaching in the department from which I graduated, which was political science. And one of my major professors in my master's program said, well, I'm going to give you a piece of advice since you're starting to teach for us. And I said, what's that, Dr. Jones? And he said, you can tell in a very short period of time whether or not you're going to have a good class or a bad class. And I said, okay, well, how can you tell that? And he said, if I walk into class in the morning on the first day of class and I say, good morning, class, and they reply with, good morning, Dr. Jones, it's going to be a bad class. And I thought, why is that? I said, well, what's a good class? He said, if you have a good class, there's silence and they're writing it down. They're taking notes, right? Half of you don't even take notes anymore. It's incredible to me, like people don't, like they come to class, anymore. They don't take notes. They just kind of sit there, look at the PowerPoint. And I've had students, again, we'll talk about the exam at the end of the hour and what's expected for a good essay, like question. This is Nietzsche. You question everything. Authority means nothing. You're going to question every single thing. I have students every semester after this first exam they'll be like, I think this is a completely unfair grade. I've always gotten A's in high school. Well, this isn't high school, and I don't know what they're teaching you in high school. I asked students what they read in high school. Did you read the dystopians, the great, dystopian novels, things like 1984, Fahrenheit 451, Brave New World? No, they didn't read that. What did you read? I had one student tell me that in her American literature class, they read Jackie Collins novels. And I was like, that's trash. And there's another problem with that. Jackie Collins is British. I would think in an American lit class, you should read maybe, call me crazy, American authors. But you start challenging everything, and that's what leads to this idea of subjectivism. Subjectivism is the first form of a challenge to physical ethics. And what it says is that, look, ethics is not like, if we debate things like that are really, really hard, like abortion rights, we're going to have, if I asked everybody in this class, I would be willing to bet that there are probably 25 different answers as to what we should have. Everything from it should be legal on demand to it should, be absolutely restricted, to, moderate positions, which are, I don't agree with it, but in cases of rape or incest or the health and life of the mother, it should be allowed. And so these ideas lead to this constant questioning, and subjectivism does that. Subjectivism says, look, there's no agreement on these things and we can't ever reach an agreement. My response to that would be, there are really tough questions in science too, and we don't have answers to that. And so the fact that we don't have all of the answers today doesn't mean that we won't get there. And we can get there through logical thought. The problem with subjectivism is that if we allowed this to be the case and we said we couldn't hold anybody morally culpable for things, well, then we couldn't ever say that the indiscriminate killing of a human being, the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought, that's the definition of first-degree murder. It's the common law definition of murder. It's now what we call first-degree murder. The unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. That's what we call in law an elements test, because it's hard. You have to meet each of those elements in order to be convicted by a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. So they have to prove that the killing is unlawful. What's an unlawful killing? Well, I don't have some defense, like I was acting in self-defense, or I'm a soldier on a battlefield, right? Those are lawful killings. So it has to be an unlawful killing, human being, that means a person, with malice aforethought. That's what we call the mens rea element. We have to prove that you thought about it maliciously beforehand. Now, it's impossible to get inside somebody's mind, so how do we prove that? Well, you have to prove it usually with circumstantial evidence, like the surrounding facts and circumstances. The Murdoch murders, which are going on trial. There's a very famous attorney in South Carolina that's on trial right now for murdering his wife and sons. Turns out he was in financial difficulty and needed the insurance or something like that. Right? So subjectivism, I think we can all agree. Like, you don't have to experience murder to say I probably want to live, and that's wrong. Right? So we can come up with, and what we do find is that in the anthropological record and in the anthropological and sociological record, we do find 3 prohibitions that all societies have agreed on. And if we can find 3, we can probably find more. 1 is that you can't kill members of the in-group indiscriminately. 2 is that you can't steal from members of the in-group, right? And 3 is that you cannot bear false witness against members of the in-group. Now we can have others. Cultural relativism, on the other hand, says that rather than ethics being based in the individual, it's based in the group. And this leads to the idea of legal positivism. Did I talk about legal positivism in here? So legal positivism says that, and William Rehnquist, who was the Chief Justice of the United States for a very long time, was a big proponent of legal positivism as a form of ethics. So legal positivism says that the highest form of ethics is found in the law. And we do tend to define ourselves by what we criminalize, particularly the criminal law. So we define ourselves as a society by that which we criminalize. Capital murder or murder in the first degree, unlawful killing, human being, malice aforethought. We also criminalized for many, many years in almost every nation, and the United States particularly for many years criminalized homosexual sodomy, right? How do you prosecute that? You really don't, for the most part, because this is an intimate act that doesn't take place in the public square, and so it's hard to catch. We no longer do that. But for a legal positivist, they'd say, look, it's just the law that defines ethics. The problem with that is the law itself may be immoral. Again, the law is an important consideration when we talk about ethics. So we have the law and we have ethics, and there's some overlap, and we should consider the law, but the law itself may be immoral. And we said that. We said that the laws in Nazi Germany were immoral. We've recognized in our own society that the laws of segregation under Plessy versus Ferguson were immoral. And they were overturned by Brown versus the Board of Education in 1953, yes.
So are you saying that legal positivism is a subset of the cultural?
It is a subset of cultural relativism, yeah. That what we define in our culture, and for Rehnquist, it was primarily the criminal law, is the highest form of ethics. Again, the problem with this is it was a criminal act to violate the segregation laws in the South. The police came out and arrested you if you violated those laws. We now say that's immoral. Psychological egoism says that either as a result of nature or nurture, did we talk about this? You can't help, right, what you do. This is the one that doesn't sound right. Both of these sound right if you think about it. When we talk about really hard subjects, like should abortion be legal or illegal, that's a really tough conversation to have. And so it seems, like, okay, well, we can't all agree on this, so maybe it's up to the individual to decide whether, for themselves, whether they should do that or not. The cultural relativists would say, well, it's not up to the individual. We've got to use society. So we're going to define, things in society. For these two seem right. This one doesn't seem right. Psychological egoism says either as a result of nature, nurture, or a combination of the two, we behave in very predictable ways that we can't help. We think that we have something called free will, but we don't. And there's a marketer who's actually done a study on this. He's not a marketing academic, he's a practitioner, and he wrote a book. His name is Martin Lindstrom, and he wrote a book called Biology, Buyology. So not biology in terms of the study of living organisms. He wrote a book called Biology in terms of the study of why we buy things. Why it is we buy things. And he says we can predict as marketers with great accuracy whether or not a product is going to be successful in this very postmodern world with a great deal of accuracy, even though people might say that they don't like things. And one of the studies that he does, and we were actually doing this in my doctoral program, we had an fMRI machine that was purchased between the psychology department and the College of Business at NMSU so that we could do these kinds of studies. One of the studies he points to is the ads for smoking. How many of you have seen these ads for smoking? The anti-smoking campaign ads. Everybody's seen them, right? Let's see if I can find one on YouTube quickly. Hopefully it won't cut me off. They have a tendency to stop my live stream, so I'll have to check if maybe I won't play one, I'll just find one here. So this one was a kind of a famous ad. This was a woman who has obviously, and she went through this ad talking about, this is what smoking has done to me. If you want to, this is how I get dressed in the morning. And she's having to put on a wig. She's having to put in her dentures because smoking, it not just causes lung cancer, it causes esophageal cancer, cancer of the gums, your teeth fall out. You can, end up having things, cut off of your body as a result of smoking. And so they play these ads. A famous one, starts with the tobacco companies, and they show like the camel, and they show all these beautiful people. And the ad says something like, tobacco companies tell you that it's cool to smoke, that the popular people smoke. But would you smoke if you knew that you would end up like this? And then they just cut away to this guy who's in a wheelchair. He's an amputee, obviously, as a result of cardiovascular issues and having gangrene in his limbs and extremities. And so they play these ads. And the idea behind these ads is that it's going to get people to stop smoking, right? Well, they do the study and they put people in this fMRI machine and they look at their brain activity as they're watching the ads. And before they say things like, if you see this ad, or they ask them, on surveys, does this make you want to quit smoking? And the smokers who they do this study on all say, oh yeah, that ad's, I'm horrified by that ad. When they play the ad for them and they're in the machine, the part of the brain that is firing is actually the pleasure part of the brain. It's the hypothalamus is sending signals to the pleasure part. So these people are watching these ads. They're saying, no, I don't want to smoke anymore. I of course want to quit. And they're jonesing for a cigarette, right? They just can't wait to get outside and go smoke a cigarette. Now, Lindstrom points to this as evidence that what happens is we create needs and wants, and we can predict how people will behave using things like fMRI technology. And that means that we don't really have free will. These people are saying things. They're using what we call socially desirable responses on surveys, which is everybody says who's a smoker, I want to quit. And in fact, they don't. Now, I have two friends that I was talking with them about this. They're like, no, I don't want to quit. And I say this as somebody, I smoked for a lot of years. I thought my car wouldn't go without a cigarette. And I just quit cold turkey one day. My spouse at the time had quit and she was nagging me. I was down to like 3 cigarettes a day and it was just constant. And I was like, I'll just quit. She got on Chantix and she insisted that her personality did not change. It changed. Like, I am convinced that's one of the reasons. That and the, brutally honest comments that I have, probably combined with the fact that I just quit. I said, fine, I'll just quit. And I will tell you that for a year, I was probably a real ass.
Is that why you called her ugly?
I did not call her ugly. I said that she didn't
Yes,
look
you did.
good. I did not say that. Like this. So people put these kinds of, they take they comments or what they think are quotes and they put them in student evaluations. And it's like, if you're going to quote me, like, it's on video, people go back and watch the video. If you're going to quote me, get the quote correct.
Okay, I think you
I
said
never said ugly. I said you look like death in pastel. That's true. Right? I mean, she is a winter. No. If you're a strawberry blonde, you shouldn't be wearing pastels. It washes you out.
She should have known that. She should have known that. Not on her.
Good God. Wear black. Exactly. But I quit smoking. I know 2 people that have said, I just don't want to quit. They're like, it's the only thing that relaxes me. One of them has her medical marijuana card, and she is the only person I know who can have sub-psychotic rage, well, higher than a kite. And literally, I'm like, I thought this was supposed to calm you down. And she gets on the phone. She works for us, and she'll get on the phone and she'll start screaming at people. And I'm like, you just were outside getting high. Like, how can you, aren't you supposed to be eating cookies and vegging on the couch right now? Only person I know that can smoke pot, but she insists that smoking is what makes her calm. So Lindstrom says, we don't really have free will. We can't help but want the things that we want. And maybe that's true. I can tell you that as somebody who smoked for a long time, that it wasn't until very recently. I quit 17 years ago now. And for a long time, I would walk past somebody smoking a cigarette and I'd say, God, that smells good. I didn't pick it back up. It was, the first time that I didn't think that a cigarette smelled good was probably in the last year when I went into a casino and I'm just like, oh my God. I Like, it's overwhelming in here. What's going on? The problem with this theory that, you know, first of all, my argument to Lindstrom is that that ad is not designed to get people to stop smoking. You're testing the wrong population. That ad is designed to prevent the only group of people that are smoking in greater numbers among every demographic except yours. Smoking is on the decline. It's on the increase among young people, right? Among your demographic. It's on the decline among every other demographic out there. It's on the decline. But that ad is not designed to get the committed smoker, right? That ad is designed to stop people from smoking in the beginning. So you're looking at, so my argument is you're looking at the wrong population. The other problem with psychological egoism is that if we accepted it as true, I mean, it doesn't tell us what to do when people are enormously conflicted. People are oftentimes very conflicted over the choices that they have to make. And say that people always behave in this way or another is just not true. A lot of us are conflicted every day. We have, you know, challenges that we have to meet. And so it's difficult to dispense with, but I think if you look at human behavior, to say this always happens, it's very suspect when we say people always do this. They always behave in their own selfish interests. You know, it conflates two things. So as part of logic and critical thinking, one of the problems that we have with it is that it conflates when we say that people are always selfish, and that's what psychological egoists will say is people are always selfish. And you say, well, that's not true. Look at Mother Teresa. Well, the psychological egoist would say she got good feelings out of the fact that she was helping the world's poorest, most unwanted people. That's just what she wanted to do. That's where it goes wrong. It relies on a fallacy called equivocation. It says that the feelings that flow from something are the same thing as the motives for doing the act. And that's not necessarily true. Just because I feel good about helping my neighbor out doesn't mean that that was the motivation for it in the beginning, right? So those are the ethical theories. Those are the challenges to the ethical theories. The challenges are emotive. They are not based in reason, and they don't allow for universal application, and that's why they are invalid theories. So let's talk about how these apply to the corporate world and corporate social responsibility. So CSR. I use Walmart a lot in my discussion. Walmart is, I think they are still currently the world's largest private employer. That may be being challenged by Amazon, but the last time I looked, they were still the largest employer in the United States in terms of numbers of people. Amazon may overtake them because they are such a labor-intensive business now, in that they have hired, they've created their own logistics system. And so they are hiring people, but they're simply, even if Amazon has overtaken them in recent history, Walmart is still a huge employer. They're the largest retailer of socks, toothpaste, gun, textiles, and diamonds. I bet you didn't know this. They're the largest retailer of the can hardly. That's the I can hardly see it diamond, you know, that you get from the diamond display at Walmart. Walmart became so large because they did something that went against historic trends. They changed, because of this enormous purchasing power that they have, they changed the power in the channel of distribution. So historically, in channels marketing, the manufacturer had all of the power. And in many instances, they still do with regard to everyone other than Walmart and now probably Amazon. What do I mean by that? Well, why did the manufacturer have all of the power in the channel? Because they set the initial price. They were the ones who set the price. And then you went through the marketing channel and all these middlemen, and they added value by giving you time utility, place utility, and form utility. And they took their cut for that. And then you got to the retailer who charged usually what was called the MSRP, the manufacturer's suggested retail price. Walmart changed that. So you had this manufacturer historically who set the price and then pushed goods through the channel of distribution, through transportation companies and warehousers and other middlemen, stock jobbers, and ultimately the retailer, and they controlled most of the power in that channel. Walmart reverses that. When they become this huge behemoth of a company, they were able to start telling companies what they were going to pay for it. They began to be able to tell, for example, manufacturers of lawnmowers. Walmart is one of the largest sellers of lawnmowers in the nation. And what does Walmart want to sell a lawnmower for? Anybody want to guess? It's gone up because of inflation. We're experiencing this unusual inflationary period right now. We've had historically low inflationary, but for years and years and years, about 15 years, Walmart sold their price point on lawnmowers was the same for about a 15-year period. It's gone up again because of inflation. But what do you think Walmart wanted to sell a lawnmower for?
What kind? A pusher?
A push mower, yeah. What do you think they wanted to sell it for?
$80.
Oh, you're a little low. But you're close. So I'll give you a duck. It was $100. That's what they wanted to sell a lawnmower for, was $100. Which means that they have to buy it for considerably less than $100 in order to make a profit, right? So they wanted to sell a lawnmower for about $100. I will submit to you that if you buy a lawnmower for $100 from Walmart, it's probably not going to last very long. Walmart is not selling Honda lawnmowers, right? Because a Honda lawnmower, Honda push mower, even a push mower is considerably more, even for before we had all this unusual inflation, considerably more than $100. I don't think you could get a Honda for probably a push mower for probably under about $600 during that time period. One of the companies that Walmart went to and wanted to sell their mowers was Snapper. And Snapper said, we're not, there was an article written, you can look it up, called The Man Who Said No to Walmart. Snapper produced more quality goods, and they told Walmart, no, we're not, because Walmart basically wanted to buy mowers. If you're going to sell it for $100, you can guess. They won't tell you exactly what they want to buy it for because they consider that proprietary information. But you can guess based on the standard retail markup that they wanted to buy it for about $50. And Snapper said, no, we're not going to do that. There was an article about 7 years later that called The Man Who Changed His Mind. And Snapper decided that they did want to sell to Walmart. But Walmart, went to the manufacturers. If you want to sell to Walmart, you have to go to Bentonville. Historically, retailers went to middlemen or the manufacturer and negotiated the price at that manufacturer's headquarters, not Walmart. You want to sell to Walmart, you better have an office in Bentonville, Arkansas. Right? So they've got this huge amount of power. Now, one of the things that they've used to do this and build this infrastructure are labor practices that are highly ethically suspect. When Sam Walton started Walmart, so he didn't start out as Walmart. Sam Walton, he interestingly enough is from Oklahoma originally. He was born in Kingfisher, Oklahoma, and his family moved to Arkansas, I think when he was in elementary school. His first business was not called Walmart. He bought what was called a 5 and Dime, which was branded as Ben Franklin. And they're called 5 and Dimes because almost everything was either 5 cents or 10 cents in the store. One of the things that he popularized in this early venture was flip-flops. Nobody had ever heard of flip-flops. But he thought, those would be really, he lived in Arkansas at the time, as Ben Franklin was in Arkansas. And he thought those would be really popular in Arkansas because it's hot outside. And shoes, I see this all the time. I'm kind of amazed that everybody in here appears to be wearing what look like sensible shoes that'll actually keep your feet warm. It's just amazing to me how many of my students come in shorts, flip-flops, and a parka. And it's like, I can tell you why you're freezing. You've got flip-flops on, no heat being preserved there. But he popularized flip-flops by buying them in the bulk and just throwing them out on an end cap in the store. The guy who was the owner of the property where he had this decided that would make a great business for his son-in-law, and so he didn't renew Sam's lease. So he had to go somewhere else, and he went to, I think it was Rogers, Arkansas was the next place that he opened up a store, and he opened up what was called Walton's. That was his first branded using his name, and that morphed into Walmart. Now, when he started, he didn't call his employees, clerks or stockers or other names that we used in the industry at the time. He called them associates, and he gave them stock in the company. And he provided pretty good health insurance, and almost everybody was full-time, and he provided good benefits. After Sam died, the corporate directors decided that was all just way too much overhead. So what did they do? They started employing more and more part-time people, because you don't have to offer, historically, at that point in time, before the Affordable Care Act, you didn't have to offer part-time people benefits like health care. You didn't have to offer them paid time off, right? All of these things. And so they cut their labor force and turned them into largely part-time or three-quarter time employees to avoid these costs. As a result, many of those people were living below the poverty line and were eligible for state, benefits like Medicaid and, CHIPS, the child for their children, the child health insurance program, which is heavily government subsidized. So basically, Walmart was relying on the government to subsidize what they used to give. They were relying on the government subsidies to provide their employees this benefit that they used to provide. Now, from a purely utilitarian economic standpoint, that's good. It increased overall shareholders' wealth. But who ends up, when people are on Medicaid or when they have no insurance at all and they go to the hospital because they're horribly sick, who ends up footing that bill ultimately for the cheap goods that we get at Walmart? We do. The taxpayers do. So Walmart went from being sort of this paragon of ethical employment practices to being one of the most, sort of despised companies on earth. And we all go there. We have to. I'm like a man going to the gallows when I have to go to Walmart. It's a horrible experience. I have found evidence that the Yeti exist, and they are in the Guthrie Walmart with all their Yeti children, right? I mean, like these massive hulking people that insist on bringing all 12 of their children, that are coughing and sneezing and touching everything into Walmart. But I still go because, they have the lowest prices on a lot of stuff that you need. And they've done this largely by getting the government to subsidize those labor benefits, right? Many of Walmart's employees were actually eligible for not just Medicaid, they were eligible for SNAP benefits, food subsidies, right? So the classic model of corporate social responsibility, largely predicated on a neoclassical economist named Milton Friedman, who, in my opinion, is one of the most unethical people in modern academia, rooted it all in this free market theory. Friedman says that corporations have almost no social responsibility other than to make wealth for their owners, for their shareholders. So Walmart had no ethical responsibility other than to make their shareholders wealthy, and shareholders of Walmart became enormously wealthy. If you had bought Walmart stock at its initial public offering, if you'd bought $1,000 worth of Walmart stock and you'd kept it through all of the stock splits that it's gone through today, you would be a millionaire many, many, many times over. This classical model is grounded in the legal theory of property and rights, the idea that all we need to do is just look at property rights. Well, one of the problems with this is that, and Friedman says government should adopt a completely laissez-faire approach to business. One of the problems is that there's a fundamental misunderstanding here of what property is. Why do I say that? Well, you know, I think Friedman would argue just let the market decide what property is. We don't quite do that though. Some of the things that you might think of as being property are not. And some of the things that you might not come to top of mind of thinking of as being property are. Let's take an example. What do you think is mostly property? Well, we tend to think of something that we can touch. It has tangible attributes as being property. This iPhone is my personal property. It's what we call in law a chattel property. So there are two kinds of property. There are chattel property in classical property theory, and then there's real property. Chattels are all of the things that are not real. And by real property, what do we, well, that's land. And the things that are permanently attached, or we think of as being permanently attached to the land, are real property. So things can start out as chattel property and they can become real property. When you buy the bag of cement, for example, to build a house, that's chattel property. When you pour the foundation of the house, that becomes real property, right? Is your body your property? No, it's not. Property has three characteristics that are called ad. It is alienable, divisible, and descendable. Alienable. During my lifetime, I can legally dispose of the property. I can legally sell my iPhone. It's mine, I own it. I can legally go and trade it in at whoever I'm using as my current provider. I think I've currently got Verizon. I can sell it on eBay. There's a big market for these devices, right? Or if I die, it will either pass by devisee, means through a will, or if I die intestate, and most people die intestate, which means without a will, it will descend to my heirs. That's what constitutes property. So things that you might think of as being property, because you can touch it, you can see it, you can feel it, like your body is not property. It's creepy. You cannot will yourself, your stuffed corpse, to your great Aunt Sally. You cannot be mummified. You know, that's creepy. Don't do that. You can't sell your kidney on the black market. Creepy. Don't do that. In the early era of eBay, there was a guy who tried to sell his virginity in an auction on eBay. Creepy. Can't do that. Your virginity is not property.
How much did it go for?
I think they took it down because that's called prostitution and it's illegal, right? In most states except Nevada. I mean, that's creepy. Don't do that. So your body is not property. Your cocaina is not property. You can touch it. You can sniff it. Not property. You cannot will it to your descendants. You cannot sell it legally. You will get arrested, right? If you do this. Now, it's an interesting question. Is your marijuana property?
Do you have, it's like a plan.
I don't know. The state of Oklahoma says it's your property. The federal government says it's not. This is an interesting question.
Is it kind of a perfect storm situation where you have to be in the right state where it is legal, you have to be able to legally own it, and then whoever is getting it has to be able to legally own it?
We can place restrictions on property. Okay, so cigarettes are perfectly legal. They are property. You can sell them basically. You know, when you die, if your Aunt Sally is a big smoker, she can get your cigarettes in the will or whatever. They can't go to somebody under 18. We place restrictions on that. You can't sell liquor to somebody who's under 21. In Oklahoma, if you have a medical marijuana card, you can sell this stuff legally. So I guess the state of Oklahoma defines it as property. The federal government does not. It is still a Schedule I narcotic according to the federal government. My answer, this would be a great law school exam, is it property? A property exam, is marijuana become property? Well, it sort of depends on how you think of, you know, which sovereign has the greater power. Historically, we had what was called the layer cake model of government. So in the United States, we have a form of government called a federal government. So there's dual sovereigns. We have two sovereigns. You have the federal government, which is sovereign, and then the state governments, which are sovereign. And for most of our history, the states were the larger of the two. The federal government was really small. It was mostly concerned with, in the early days of our nation, establishing post offices and building infrastructure and providing for the common defense. That was pretty much it, right? That's no longer the case. We now have what's called the marble cake model of federalism, where you don't know where one begins and the other, because, for example, things like Medicaid, that's a federal program. It's administered by who? The states, right? And so in Oklahoma, this governor kept trying to do away with Medicaid, saying we're not going to take the money, and the voters decided to overturn that decision, and they decided to take the Medicaid expansion. The numbers matter here. The states, for example, can set the threshold limit for recipients of Medicaid, and they set it predicated on the poverty level. And so the state can set the limit. They can say you have to be at over 100% of the poverty level by some figure in order to receive this benefit. If the lower you set the number, the more people you get on Medicaid, right? And in states like Oklahoma, the governor didn't want to expand Medicaid. He wanted to get away with it, and the voters overturned that. So this is a perfect storm. I don't know. We have conflicting regulations with regard to the marijuana. I don't know if it's property or not. It's an interesting question. If enough states do it, start legalizing it, and the government's out of step, could you make a, 14th Amendment argument that states' rights, trump under the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment? Or does the federal government still reign supreme? I don't know. The problem with this model is that it doesn't take into account externalities. So first of all, property is important, but property is defined by the sovereign. That which the sovereign defines, the sovereign can take away. So cocaine may, in fact, at one point in time, cocaine was property. It was what was the major ingredient in Coca-Cola when they first started out. That's why they called it a relaxing beverage. So it was property, and then it was not property. So property rights are important, but they're limited by the government. The critical or the classical model also doesn't take into account what we call externalities or market failures. This is highlighted by something that economists call in game theory, the tragedy of the commons. And there used to be a really nice game that you could play online. It's no longer up. I don't know why they took it down. It was called the tragedy of the bunnies. And the game had two forms. So you are a bunny merchant and they have all of these bunnies out in this field and you click on bunnies and you grab them and then you get money for grabbing them and selling them. And what ends up happening at the end, and you can play against the computer. So the computer is a player, you're a player, and there are all of these bunnies out on the field. And you're grabbing these bunnies and you're selling them. And at the end of the first round, what happens? Well, there are no bunnies left for anybody to sell because we've sold all of the bunnies, right? We have degraded the commons. This comes from a classical sort of historic culture. In many places in New England, for example, they had sheep's commons. There was an area in New York that is part of this. There was a sheep common, and there's a very famous restaurant that's on that sheep common in New York. It's called the Tavern on the Green, and it was closed for a while, and they've reopened it, I think. I think it's still open, but that was the sheep common. And what ends up happening is that everybody brought their sheep into town, and before you know it, sheep denude. They're just like goats. Like if you put a goat on a lot, in a limited space, before long, what's going to happen to that lot? It'll be what we call in agriculture dry lotted, meaning that all of the vegetation is gone. Goats will eat everything and rip up the roots, right? And they will denude the entire area. So they had this sheep common, and of course, what happens? Everybody's worse off as a result of these externalities of overgrazing on the sheep common. Because everybody has an incentive to put as many sheep out there as they want, right? So you have these externalities, you have these damages. We're seeing this in Ohio play out. There's an externality. Railway shipping is a very efficient way of moving goods around the country until you have a major accident and there's a chemical spill and things like the public water supply are compromised and the air quality is compromised. So the problem with Milton Friedman is just, let the market do what it wants, is that it doesn't account for these externalities, like air pollution. We're all worse off as a result of the fact that companies don't want any EPA regulation of the air quality. Why not? If you're an oil company, you want to sell as much oil as you can. And you want to produce that oil as cheaply as you can. And we have done enormous degradation to the air quality in this country. The number of people who are suffering from upper respiratory illnesses every year has increased exponentially. And we see a perfect natural experiment that occurred during COVID. What happened during COVID? In places like Los Angeles, the air quality went up because everybody was doing what? Staying home. Right? We watched this in Beijing. They showed photos like, the day before everything shut down for COVID and 6 months later on the news, and it's incredible. So businesses don't account for these externalities that often affect our everyday lives. The number of people that are contracting lung cancer who have never smoked has risen over the past 50 years, largely as a result of lax air quality standards. So the classic model doesn't provide for these failures. So what's a modified version of the classical model? It was proposed by Norman Bowie. And what he says is the first thing that businesses have a moral obligation to do is first do no harm. Now we see lots of businesses that don't do this. Cigarette companies, they are providing an enormously harmful product. A secondary duty is that you have a duty to prevent harm. Railroad companies have a duty to make sure that their tracks are in good working order, that their trains are in good working order, that they hire qualified people to run these that don't lead to trains jumping the track and creating huge problems. And then third, maybe we can't enforce this, we should say you've got to prevent harm. We do this, and we do this through the law, and we do this through ethics, where ethics and the law have caught up to each other. We have encouraged people to prevent harm. First duty, do no harm. That means that I'm not actively engaged in something that harms you as a business. The second is you have a duty to prevent harm. There's a wonderful series of cases that illustrate what we have enforced in the law as part of corporate social responsibility, and it's called the railroad turntable cases. So forever and ever and ever at common law, the rule was that trespassers were owed no duty. If you trespass, we consider private property, land, particularly real property, to be absolutely sacrosanct in this nation, far more so than they do in any other nation. And I think that's largely as a result of our culture. One of the things that makes us different as a nation from other countries that we came from, like countries in Western Europe or our founding country in terms of our principles of law that we derive them from, which is England, is that we are a big country and we have always expanded every time we've gotten too cramped. So one of the things that we have really valued more so than you do in other countries is this idea of property ownership, land ownership. This is part of the American dream. When I was a political scientist, I used to have students write this paper. You have to have some kind of written work in your classes that's required. And one of the things that I did, all of my colleagues would have students do in political science, sort of a traditional research paper, and they're always horrific and boring. And it was like torture for me to have to read these. So I came up with a different assignment. I called it My American Dream. And I had students write about their American dream. And I said, this is interesting. This is something that's uniquely American and part of the American political heritage is this American dream. If you went to Germany, nobody runs around saying my German dream is, but we do in America. We talk about it all the time. We talk about it on the news. We write about it in studies. And what's the heart of that American dream? Well, for most people, the foundation of that dream is to own a home. It starts with home ownership. And so we have this idea that property is just absolutely sacrosanct. Real property is absolutely sacrosanct. A man's home is his castle. And trespassers forever and ever and ever at common law were owed no duty. If you trespass on my property, I owe you no duty. I can set a bear trap out there to keep you off. I can, I can set up a reciprocating machine gun that uses, movement detection and mow you down. You're owed no duty. That was the common law rule. And then people started moving into the cities and urbanizing, and this worked pretty well as long as we were a country that was pretty much rural and agricultural, and you kept your kids at home and they couldn't go very far because you rode a mule or a horse into town, and people lived on their 40 acres and farmed, and life was swell. But then people started moving into the cities because we became less and less agriculturally based, because we had all of these wonderful efficient ways of farming that produced greater and greater amounts of foodstuffs with fewer and fewer people. Today, very few people are engaged. When I first started teaching years ago, almost everyone in class had some historic tie to agriculture. That's not true anymore. None of you. I mean, I am again a rarity because I was born and raised on a cattle ranch in northern New Mexico. And I'd be willing to bet that there may be one of you. Is there anybody in here who has a farming background? 1, 2, 3. When I first started teaching, almost everybody, at least they had a farm. Their grandparents owned a farm or something like that. This is rare. Now we've only got 3. Last semester I had none when I asked that question in this class that had any kind of farming background. As people started to move to the city, their kids, they're no longer out climbing trees and stuff, and kids are wonderfully inventive, And there are these things. In the olden days, railroad engines didn't go forward and backward. They do now. You can put them in reverse. So when you got to the end of the line, you didn't just throw the engine off and forget about it. You had what was called a turntable that would turn it around and send it back the track the other way. You all probably have never experienced this. When I was a kid, there used to be these horrific devices on playgrounds that were called a merry-go-round. You could get on them and you could go really fast and spin people off. Well, that's what these turntables look like to kids. Like this looks like a toy, something to play with. And they were dangerous. And kids would get on them and they would get their legs cut off or their fingers cut off. And so the law began to change. Over a series of cases called the railroad turntable cases, the law began to say, you can't do that. You have to, if you have a dangerous device on your property, you have to be able to secure it so that people don't get hurt. Even though they're trespassers, normally, if you've got a dangerous device, it's easy to secure. This has led to what's called the attractive nuisance doctrine. And it affects people who have, if you grew up with a pool, you probably had to have a fence around that pool unless you lived out in the country, because kids are attracted to water and they're going to jump in the pool and they might drown. So you got to put a fence around it, right? So what does the stakeholder theory then start to look like? Well, stakeholder theory says that you have to take a look at the totality of the circumstances and that you have to balance claims against competing claims. So in a totality of the circumstances, you have to think about all of the actions that a business takes and how it's going to affect all of the stakeholders. The stakeholders are not just the customers of your business. They are also other individuals who may be affected, your suppliers, the public at large who may be affected by your products. So it's this balancing approach. The modern approach is that we take a balance. Now, the criticism of this is that it's hard to do this, and it doesn't provide any real practical advice. I think that's an oversimplification, and I think businesses, we can, particularly in an age when we have more computing power in that device right there than existed in the entire world in 1950, we can figure this out. So let me talk for just a few minutes. I've got 2 minutes left. I'm going to talk about the test. What a C-level response, and I think there is an example of a C-level response on the website. If there is on the D2L site, if there isn't, I'll put it up there. A C-level response would be a 5-paragraph essay. What is a 5-paragraph essay? Well, you should have learned this in high school. Again, students don't. This is a C-level response. It has a thesis statement. What is a thesis statement? I'm going to look at all of the facts and circumstances recurring in this fact pattern that I give you in the essay. And I'm going to analyze those, and using utilitarian principles, I'm going to come up with a solution that provides the greatest happiness for the most number of people. That's a thesis statement, right? And then you provide evidence to support. You find facts in the fact pattern for decisions that you make that support that, and then you reach a logical conclusion. If you write 1 paragraph, you're not going to get very far. If you write 5 paragraphs, you're going to get a C, that has a reasonable, and there's a way you should write. This is the way academics write. My mother says, Grant, your writing is uninspired. Yes, that's right. I'm not a creative writer. My mother was an English teacher. She taught creative writing. I had a student one year write this essay that I approached this problem eager as a squirrel in an oak forest. When wham, bam, the answer came to me like an elephant in a tumbling routine. And I wrote, I leapt like a gazelle to the conclusion, you deserve an F for making me read this dribble. Thesis statement, supporting ideas, conclusion. What does an A-level paper look like? Well, it's going to, involve, I'm going to use comparison and contrast. I'm going to use both utility and deontological ethics and compare and contrast, and then figure out which produces the best result. That's going to be more than 5 paragraphs, right? That's going to be an A or B level paper, right? The devil is going to be in the details. I am out of time. Yes, go ahead.
There's other multiple choice or whatever, is it just?
Yes, there's multiple choice. There are multiple guests.
Yeah.
Multiple guests. Yep. So if you got a duck, come and see me.
No.
You have next Tuesday. You don't have to come to class
No.
because we will.
Is the test timed?
So,
Nope.
Tuesday,
It's not timed.
okay, so the test isn't.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.